Hi everyone, I'm Ben Orozco. I'm an artist and designer for the solo exhibit TOPIA, which is on view at the Arts and Literature Lab in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm very excited to be having a conversation with Assistant Professor Andrew Stevens from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Agricultural and Applied Economics Department. During my research making this body of work, I was thinking about the flattening of space in regards to monoculture. I started asking myself what happens to an entire landscape when it's reduced down to three different crops in a grid, and why is that the case? In my research around conventional farming practices, I discovered that there is such thing as an agroeconomist, which is such an interesting perspective to think about why our landscapes might have ended up the way they are now. And so working in a field that has so many different disciplines within it in agriculture, I decided to reach out to Andrew. And yesterday we had a chance to look over the gallery together. Today we'll be talking about a few questions that came up and some things that have been on my mind. In my research around conventional farming practices, I discovered the Agro Economist, and I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about what is the role of an agricultural economist, and can you talk about some of your areas of research or specialty?
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, Ben, and I really enjoyed looking at the work yesterday. So thanks for the invitation. So agricultural economics is an old field. People think that I study corn, and I really don't. And then people think that I study money, and I really don't. I study people, I study decisions, and I try to understand the decisions that lead to the environment that we see, the landscape that we see, and the diets that we eat. So broadly speaking, I'm an agricultural economist who studies production, so things like crop choice and land use and agricultural policy. And then I also study consumer demand of food goods to try and understand how, why, when, and where we consume the foods that we do and what the implications of those choices are. I really do a lot of data-driven work. So rather than sitting at a blackboard writing a bunch of equations, I'm usually sitting behind a computer running regressions and trying to understand what the statistics tell us about how the world works.
I think about the economists in a very rigid way with this idea of the scale of having a factory build a bunch of widgets or things, and then it moves down a distribution line, and eventually it will end up in the hands of a consumer. And thinking about these very like manufactured items that are things, but it's interesting to think about that idea in terms of nature and things that have to be grown and cultivated, and figuring out how some of these things are maybe maximized and scaling up the idea of nature itself. Thinking about how complex modern agriculture can be in all these systems, I'm also wondering too about this like top-down approach and having to reduce, as you mentioned, running regressions or calculations, taking whole fields and crops and reducing them down into single numbers. When I'm talking about gridded landscapes, I'm thinking a lot about these underlying structures and how some of these structures become these binaries that work within shadow or value. For you, what are these visual patterns of agroeconomics? How are you visually navigating these complex systems of thousands or maybe millions of plants and animals?
That's a great question and a deep question. You know, an applied statistician or an economist like me really thinks about a unit of observation. And we could get really small and we could think about the observation of a single plant. We could think about a row, we could think about a field, or we could think about a county, but sort of this unit of observation down to which we sort of compress the information that we have, or up to which we aggregate the information that we have. And a parallel might be thinking about health, right? A biologist might think of a cell and how the cell works. Or, you know, a chemist might think about the strand of DNA and how the strand of DNA works. And then your doctor probably cares about how the person works. And so it's almost like Russian nesting dolls of layers of information. So thinking about the visual patterns of data in agricultural economics, for the last 100 years, the big one was thinking about a county and thinking about what the average agricultural behaviors were at a county level or land cover at the county level. Over time, we've gotten closer and closer to that fine-grained data. So a lot of work that I do tries to focus on field level decisions, for a specific plot of land, what's being done with it. I have colleagues who focus on precision agriculture, where you're looking at, maybe a 6-inch area to say, well, what's the amount of fertilizer going into that area and what's the yield of the plants in that tiny area. But in all of these cases, you can still fall back to what is the unit of observation? And for that unit of observation, we observe some characteristics. What the land cover is, what the land cover was last year, how much fertilizer is applied, what kind of tractor is used, if any. In that sense, I always fall back to thinking about data that's sort of two-dimensional, observations and characteristics. I think what gets me excited about some of this work is we have a lot of technologies that are really opening up the detail that we can extract from the real world. One of the data sets I really enjoy using is called the cropland data layer. You out there watching this video can just Google cropscape and look at it yourself. It's data that's taken by satellite that zeroes into a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel and tells you what the land cover was each year for about the last 20 years. So It's one way to think about sort of the map of agriculture in the US and how it's changing over time in really, really small areas.
That is so cool, thinking about how the land is observed both from this satellite sort of perspective, if we think about mapping, and also the really precise information that you're looking at as well. I like that comment you made about the 2D framework. How did you describe that again?
Yeah, so most of my statistics take observations with characteristics. So to use this medical example again, an observation might be a patient, and the different characteristics might be blood pressure, height, weight, age, all these other things. This gets detailed and jargony, right? But if you took linear algebra in college or have run a regression, you're inverting a matrix, a two-dimensional matrix to try and understand all of this. And mathematically also, I should be a little careful, right? So it's two-dimensional in the sense that it's a big spreadsheet in words, but each of those characteristics in its own way is a different dimension. We're capturing many dimensions of reality and visualizing them and thinking about them and dealing with them mathematically in sort of this observations by characteristics 2x2 matrix.
Thinking about the role of the economists and the agroeconomists, I've been thinking about, what is agriculture? And I think a lot about seed hybrids, and especially living out in the countryside or in more of a rural area, seeing a lot of language around maximizing yield and these really interestingly engineered seed formats. What is the benefit of maximizing yield, and do you always see it as a good thing or maybe as an ideal, or are there other ideals that maybe can be thought of differently or maybe considered aside from just taking a plot of land and trying to grow as much corn or as much of a certain resource as humanly possible?
I love this question because if you talk to a lot of producers, if you talk to a lot of agronomists even, it's easy to think that what we care about is maximizing yield. How do we get the most consumable output from this plant in an annual year or from this area of land in an annual year? But really, for over a century, agricultural economists have been saying you don't care about maximizing yield, right? What we think a small business, a farmer cares about is maximizing profit. And so understanding how the plant responds to inputs or fertilizer or seed spacing and understanding that relationship with yield is really important. But to boost yield costs more. You need more seeds, you need more fertilizer. So there's this trade-off between the benefit you get and the cost it takes to get it. What we're really interested in is understanding, well, where is that trade-off and what does that mean for sort of an economic optimal behavior? So that's one part of the conversation, which is it's easy to maximize yield. It's harder and more interesting to maximize profit. But maybe the side of the conversation that I think your work really addresses really well is that profit is one benefit of agricultural production. You might think it's a good thing to have food for people to eat. It's a good thing for the farmer to have an income and survive. But there are these other impacts of agricultural production on the environment, on the water quality 3 counties down the river, right? In my field, we call these things externalities, basically implications of this behavior that don't fit into that benefit or cost framework that the farmer faces themselves. I would say a lot of agricultural economics is thinking about, well, what are the total benefits and the total costs of this activity? Which of those are public? Which of those are private? Can we quantify them? And then look at, does the profit maximizing behavior really differ from what might be a socially optimal behavior? And if not, what kinds of policies could there be to better align those things? The easy example is if you could just tax pollution, tax nitrate runoff, and it was easy to figure out who's responsible for that runoff, which is not easy, not tractable. But if you could, well, we figure out what the cost to society is of that nitrate runoff, and you tax the producer for that and reach that social optimum.
And with that idea, I know a lot of the works that I've specifically featured have to do with monoculture. And I know we've been talking about now that there's maybe different ways to assess value. I wanted to ask you too, how greatly does the opportunity cost of monoculture maybe outweigh its alternatives at this moment, or maybe in the recent past or recent history?
So monoculture has a lot of unintended consequences, and we know a lot about the negative unintended consequences of monoculture. And because we're very, very used to it, it's harder to see all of the benefits. And I think if we could interview our great-great-great-grandparents, many of whom were in agricultural production, and describe to them sort of what the day-to-day life of being a farmer is in 2020, the quality of life that they have, and the sort of access to social mobility, especially in a country like the United States, is like, I think a lot of people would say, absolutely, go do that. It's easy to think that agricultural production is just output per unit land. And when you think about it that way, you get stuck in these interesting but unproductive conversations about, well, should we be doing organic production? Should we be intercropping? Should we adopt the Three Sisters system from ancient Mexico? And, all of these interesting conversations. But productivity is output over all inputs. And so, sure, we could grow all of the land that's currently in monoculture in integrated, multi-species, high labor organic systems. If you can convince 40% of the population to get back into agriculture working for essentially poverty wages, right? So there are these trade-offs. And I think what we see is that monoculture on the landscape is a consequence of extremely understandable individual decisions by consumers and producers. Thinking about that visual pattern on the landscape as someone's choice doesn't ring true to me. It's sort of this thing that we've stumbled into because we make all of these choices that seem entirely reasonable.
And thinking with that idea that having these hand cultivated or maybe very well intercropped, you mentioned this Three Sisters technique. I'm also thinking too about the legibility of monoculture and what role automation might have with that. I noticed that even in greenhouse spaces or highly constructed spaces, that it still was something that, even with a lot of new technologies, seems to be the easiest or most visible approach to cultivating. And maybe this will be something that will stick around with us for who knows how long.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll give you 30 seconds of Econ 101. Okay. We tend to think of production, and this is true in agriculture too, as there being some amount of trade-off between labor and capital. And by capital here, I mean things like greenhouses or tractors or spades or seeds. Part of my dissertation studied blueberry pickers in California. If you buy fresh blueberries in the grocery store, they were hand-picked. That's because the labor to pick them is cheap enough that it is more profitable than spending the millions of dollars on the fancy robot picker, right? Mm-hmm. There's some price at which that calculus changes. Automation, again, it's not some sci-fi author envisioning a magic future. It's someone looking at the numbers and saying, that's more fiscally sustainable for my farm than trying to hire low-wage agricultural labor. It's coming more and more as technology gets cheaper and cheaper and more sophisticated. We'll see more and more of it on the landscape. But that's because someone's choosing to adopt it because it makes their life better off.
That is a really good reminder just to think about, especially in terms of sci-fi. And when we think of these beautiful utopias, or we think about lab grown or lab cultivated, I think we get so caught up in the imagery of what that looks like, and we forget that oftentimes it's somebody's bottom line, and this is just what works for that producer at that time. With that idea of the future in mind, I wanted to ask you if there are any ways that agroeconomists are factoring in climate change as a risk factor, or maybe as a margin of error in terms of making your calculations, estimates, optimizations, and so on.
Absolutely. We think about risk and uncertainty all the time because it's central to understanding the economic decisions that people are making. Really broadly speaking, I think one interesting pattern that I've seen is that agriculture has moved further away from managing risk on the farm and more towards managing risk at a societal level. Back during westward expansion of the mid to late 1800s, farmers were on their own, right? You could sell your stuff. If you couldn't sell your stuff, you didn't make money. If the Dust Bowl came through, sucks to be you, right? And so what did you do? You planted a bunch of different crops that would develop at different times of the year so that you could spread your labor around different things. If one crop failed because the weather was bad for it this year, hopefully your other crop didn't fail. So there was all of this sort of internal risk management. In 2020, there is some scope for that still, but by and large agricultural producers participate in subsidized crop insurance programs where they are still managing the risk, but they're managing the risk by pooling with a bunch of other producers across the country with the government there to create a market for it. And so when their crop fails, a farmer might lose everything, they're still okay. And over time, the system continues to move, but it's really shifted the role of who's in charge of managing that risk. I think there are some really interesting conversations, both in academic research and in policy, about how can our public policies reflect back some of the unintended consequences? How can we improve some of the risk management of the actual production system without sacrificing significant efficiency gains that we've had over the last 50 years? That's exactly where I think the conversation is right now.
With that in mind and the theme of TOPIA, do you view right now this U.S. agricultural practice, let's say, since there's so many different areas or crops or livestock, I might just pick the big three, is that corn, soy, and wheat? Do you view the general practices around those as more utopian or dystopian in terms of outputs, land health? Where is this crop actually going? Who's buying it? Is that yield being maximized, and so on?
So the correct answer is, of course, it's both, right? I'm sure someone on the other side of that screen is very grumpy with that answer. But I think, especially from an anthropocentric perspective, which economists really are, right? We care about the environment insofar as humans value the environment, right? We're a very human-focused discipline. Through that lens, I think you've got to look at all of this and what we've been able to build as a society on top of it and say, a lot of this is utopic. The fact that, 98% of the population doesn't have to work in agriculture because there is enough food and it's cheap enough that they can do other stuff. I think a lot of people would say that's pretty utopic. Many of those people also look at the system that supports that and says, there are problems. Aspects of that are super dystopic. There are people who get dealt a hand into life where they are picking those blueberries, who may or may not have legal status to do so and don't have protections in the social safety net. So of course that's dystopia. So I mean, it's both, which is why I have a job in some sense.
And it's good to have somebody thinking about the mind of a producer, and me personally having some relationship to our family farm. You really do need people who can see from this bigger lens, because a lot of people are so focused on that individual, what's happening right now. This is a fun question that goes in line with that utopian or dystopian. I found this term while I was doing a little bit of research around carbon sequestration farms, a term called the green desert. Do you know what that is? Have you heard of that?
So I haven't really heard the term green desert widely used, but carbon
Yeah.
sequestration more broadly is this really interesting place we're at in the policy conversation. If someone's watching this video 10 years in the future, it'll be really interesting to see if we're still talking about carbon sequestration in agriculture or not. There is this idea that, and this is really true, if you care about the environment, if you care about the planet, agriculture is one of, if not the largest way that humans have affected the landscape on this planet. And so even if there's a small effect, if you multiply it by all of agriculture, it can be a big effect. And so thinking about the amount of carbon that is in the soils, in the biomass of plants that are currently growing, is a really big part of the current climate policy debate.
Yeah, it's something that I am thinking about too, in terms of the fact that our arable lands are a fixed amount to some extent and a shrinking amount. And so it will be interesting to see where this question goes, especially moving towards in the future, and what the face of agricultural production will look like in 10 years, like you mentioned. Well, thank you so much for your insight, Andrew. It's been really good to think about these bigger picture things and maybe compare and contrast some of the ways that we've been both thinking about what a parcel of land looks like, how it functions, and the structures that maybe lie underneath that. Did you have any thoughts on the show? Was there any work that you feel like resonated with you as you were walking through the gallery space?
The gallery space, the individual pieces really grew on me as I spent more time with them. And I think, they are deep in their simplicity. I really like the juxtaposition of different things. I also picked up on this sense of, I think we're hardwired as humans to try and control our surroundings, not in some sort of external, I have to control you, but in some sense of, I have to control me. I have to control my life and my situation. And agriculture and the way that we do it, in some sense, is this very comforting way to feel like we're in charge of our own environment. In some ways, I feel like that's a false narrative that we tell ourselves. And climate change and natural disasters are really obvious ways that that's a false narrative. But in some other senses, you look at curving parallel lines and it's just like, oh, it's beautiful, right? The order is comforting. And so it was really fun to reflect on those themes in the space.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for your time, for visiting the show, and for entertaining some of my questions. I'll provide some links for people to follow your research, find you on Twitter, because I know that's where you're posting some exciting discoveries. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Ben. And anyone watching, if you haven't seen the show, definitely try to see it before it's gone.